Welcome to The Beat. This is the podcast where we talk about building equity, accountability, and trust with law enforcement. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by two very, very important guests. If y'all want to take a minute to introduce yourselves.
Sure.
Sure. I'm Madeline Cox. I'm one of Dr. Hall's students.
And I'm Tony Holloway. I'm the Chief of Police with St. Petersburg Police Department.
Awesome. Thank y'all for joining me today. Today, we're talking about police practices and organization. So, really looking at the structure of law enforcement agencies. And I know that there is some variation across those, but there's a general similarity, so to speak, in the way that they're structured and the way that they function. We're also going to talk a little bit about policing styles and strategies. So, to begin, when we're talking about law enforcement, there's kind of three levels of law enforcement, right? So we have local law enforcement, we have state law enforcement, and then we have federal law enforcement. And St. Pete Police Department falls within the realm of local law enforcement, right?
That is correct.
Right. And so when we're talking about local law enforcement, we're talking about police departments, we're talking about sheriff's offices, and even, more rural departments, right? Are there any other ones that fall in the realm of local law enforcement that I might be missing?
No, that would be those two areas.
Okay. And then we have state law enforcement, which you can think about like state highway patrol, right? And then federal law enforcement, there are a lot of different categories that fall within that. So today, we're going to specifically talk about local law enforcement. And I want to begin with kind of hearing from you. What is kind of the rank structure or the chain of command within police departments?
Sure. So it starts off at the very basic. So you have the officer where he or she's working a role. So you have patrol officer. From that patrol officer, then they can either become, some agency, they have corporals. Then that corporal can, he or she can be promoted to a sergeant to a lieutenant to a captain, captain to a major, major to an assistant chief, and an assistant chief to a chief.
Okay. So it's a pretty clear-cut structure. And would you say that the bottom of that structure, so you said patrol, right?
Patrol.
You have a lot more people that fill those roles.
Correct.
And then as you move up the chain of command, you have fewer and fewer people that fill those roles.
Sure, that funnel gets very small. And then an officer, they can be a police officer, then they can transfer once they get ready to become a detective. So it's almost like a lateral. So you're a patrol officer, then you move over into become a detective. So a detective's really not per se, they can't give a patrol officer direction. But if they come to a scene where the homicide scene or robbery scene, they get called out, then they're the lead investigator, so they take over the lead in the investigation. They can also take over lead investigation if there's a road sergeant there, because again, they're the one that's going to be in charge of doing the investigation. So that sergeant, he or she that's in charge of the patrol people in uniform, they will, so to speak, give control to that detective so he or she can work the case.
So thinking about all of that, like with the way decisions are handled and who has, the ability to make decisions for these things or who takes the lead on that, what are the ways that as a chief, you go about communicating or integrating officers into that structure?
So basically, if you're asking how it goes, so the officer at a certain period of time, then he or she can test to become a sergeant. So they have to study, have to know more about the laws, rules, and regulations because they are the sergeant. They are the frontline supervisors. They're the ones that are really there. They have 8 to 10 people, so they're the one that's going to be making those split decisions every day. From there, if you moved up, then there's a lieutenant. Then a lieutenant, he or she then is going to oversee the whole district. So now they got a whole city, so they have several squads that they can control. And then the major oversees the whole thing in his or her area of responsibility. So from there, you can stop. Then there's a lateral because then a detective is a spinoff from an officer. So then he or she's only going to come out because they're going to work that investigation where that patrol officer took that report. So they may ask at some given time for an officer to assist them in making an arrest or ask a sergeant to help them set a perimeter or give them guidance as they're out in the scene. So every position is a test position. As you move up in the organization, you have to test for it. Then you also have to have experience in that position. And also we look at college. How much college do you have a college degree? If you don't have your 4-year degree, you can't test to become a sergeant. And if you probably don't have your master's, you're probably very likely won't become assistant chief.
Oh, really? Oh. Is that
That's
pretty
interesting.
customary across agencies? Are you familiar with that they have those requirements?
To become a major is not saying it's a requirement. Did you have a master's degree? But then we're going to look at all the training. Did you go to investigative technique? Did you go to this type of training? Did you go to that type of training? I look at it as a police chief. If I'm going to move that person up in management, then I got to see what else do they know. Because once you become a major or higher, you're really not doing any more police work. Now you're really starting to get into administrative work. You're starting to get into
Mm.
budget. Every year you got a budget for what you need, how much equipment you need, things you need to do. You got to be able to talk to the community. You got to be able to plan down the road. You have to strategize. The average road officer, when he or she come to work, they're not worried about that. They're assigned a zone and they're responsible for that zone. As you move up, then you get to see the bigger picture, so to speak.
Mhm. You mentioned that you would take into account certain trainings and stuff when someone is testing up to become a major, you said. Does the police department offer trainings that instruct officers on administrative duties? Or is that something that they would have to learn outside of their work?
So that's a great question. So it's something they have to learn outside their work
Mhm.
through a college degree or some other type of degree that they're looking at, or it's also what they're being trained to do. So an officer comes in after he or she's worked the road for 2 years. They're going to say, okay, I want to go to investigative school. I want to learn how to do investigations on traffic fatalities, or I want to learn how to do an investigation on a burglary. So there's in-house training for that.
Mhm.
Blood splatter school. So there's all different, all the things you read
Mhm.
is really, somebody that's becoming a detective is not, hey, today you're going to be a detective. They're going to go through some type of 40 hours or 80 hours of training to get the basic skill set. And then once they get into that skill set, then there's going to be, we call a field train officer. So that field train officer, then he or she's going to help them through their training part of it.
Okay.
Uh, and then become a sergeant. Then you're going to be tested on the law because you're the one that's going to be making those split second decision because those officers are going to come to you and ask you,
Mhm.
can I make an arrest for this? Or if the officer, if he or she violates a policy, what policy did they violate and how can we make sure they don't violate that policy?
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so, are there certain degrees and educational requirements or like educational degrees you're looking for when you look at higher educational uh, like factors for looking at a promotion?
Yeah,
Did
does
I
it
say that
matter
right?
what degree it is
Yes,
or
thank
what the
you.
major is, so to speak?
No,
Mhm.
because people laugh 'cause a lot of people think I don't have a degree in criminology. My degree is in business.
Yeah.
And that's because when I was going through it, and I was going to school for criminology, and I was having a conversation with my chief, and I said, "Hey, I want to sit in your chair one day." And he says, "Well, you want to sit in my chair? Police work is a business." So he said, "You better get a degree in business because uh, my budget is over $160 million. I don't
Ooh.
really deal in investigating cases. I deal in budgeting. How do I buy cars? How do I hire people? How do I pay the salaries? All those things factor in."
That's super duper interesting because I feel like the majority of people that I talk to, my peers, a majority of them, this is my first semester taking criminology classes, and they're bright eyed and they're like, I want to be in the FBI, and that's why I'm studying criminology. And I'm like, huh, because I'm minoring in criminology, so I'm used to more sociological and like anthropological fields of work and stuff like that. So I hear this, and most people are in criminology and to go into law enforcement. So it's really
Yeah.
interesting to know that other degrees, like business, have just as important part in policing as criminology does.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you state that you have a degree in business because I think, from my perspective, a majority of the chiefs of police that I have interacted with have something equivalent to an MBA. Because it is a business, right?
Right.
And I also like that you point out that as your officers move up in rank, and they take on more administrative roles, um, a degree in criminology might not necessarily benefit you too much up there. A business degree would be very, very helpful to understand budgeting and things like that. So you're not limited to just criminology when you think about going into law enforcement. It really depends on like your long-term career goals, right? Um, I am wondering if you maybe could kind of give us an idea of years of service or timeline on how people progress up that chain of command.
So, and let me go back, 'cause you made a great point. So if you're coming in with no life experience, I would tell you need a criminology degree because you just
Right.
have no life experience. So you
Mhm.
need to come in there with a foundation. If you're coming in there with life experience, you've been in the military or you just experienced life, then you understand. So back to the original question. So when you come in, you're going to come in with that basic. We're going to teach you what's a robbery, the basic of all crimes.
Mhm.
Then after you learn that, then we're going to start teaching you on how to investigate those crimes. How do you interview someone? How do you, what you learn, back in school, criminology, that telltale. Well, now you're going to get that life experience because you're going to see that person. You're going to start, I remember that. I remember reading this, and I remember a person reacts to this question this way. So again, that criminology, if you have no life experience, and if you want to be a police officer or you want to come into law enforcement, I would tell you go that route. If you've already have that experience, then I would say then maybe you don't need that. Maybe you already have that life experience. If I had to tell someone, when I tell someone they want to become a police officer, how they want to move up, I would say within the first 2 to 3 years, you're going to learn the very basic. You're going to learn police work. You're going to learn how to answer the call. The most important thing, how to talk to people, how to read people. Once you get that down and once you understand that part of it, then you're ready to become a detective because now you understand how to make an arrest and and understand the area you work. Now you want to home in your skills. You want to say, now I want to become a detective, and now I want to go to what you asked earlier, different type of schools. I want to go to interview schools, and every detective should go to that school. Then you're going to say, then what's my specialty? Do I want to be an arson investigator? Do I want to be an economic crime detective? Do I want to be a rock? Because those are again different sets of skill sets
Mhm.
that you have to learn. So the very basic is learning how to patrol the streets and then learning how to talk to people. Because that's the biggest thing. Because when you're sitting in a room and you're interviewing someone, you have to have that interview skill.
Right.
So we send all detectives to that. Once they master that and they go like, okay, now I want to become a sergeant. Now it's time to send you to supervisory school because that's the biggest thing. How do I supervise someone? Again, going back to the basics, how do I talk to someone? How
Mhm.
do I talk to those people? How do I get those officers to buy into what we're trying to sell? And how do I motivate them? So if you want to say supervisor or coach, all those things you have to learn.
Mhm.
Then you're saying early. Then we're saying earlier. Then when you move up to the next level, now you get into the business world. How do I manage this? Because you got X amount of dollars, you got X amount of time, scheduling your people for work, and how do you do that? And then as you continue to move up, then it becomes political. How do
Yeah.
I understand the politics? So I work for the mayor, then I also work for the congressperson in the district. I work for the senator in the district because they want to know what's going on in the local area. So when they go back to Washington, D.C., they have to do that. Also, state leaders also going to want to know what's going on in the area. So as you move up, it's kind of like you have to learn a little bit of everything.
Mm.
And you bring me to a point I wanted to make sure that we made. So as the chief, is this an appointed or an elected position in any capacity?
So this is an appointed position.
Hmm.
A chief, I tell you, a chief of life expectancy is about 4 to 5 years because the chief, he or she goes with either the mayor or the city manager. Because a new mayor may want to come in and may want to bring in his or her own chief to work for them. A new city manager may want to do the same thing because again, that mayor or that city manager is getting ready to run a city, to run a business, and they're picking, so to speak, their vice president, and they may want to make sure they have that right person in that position.
Okay. Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about your career trajectory from when you began in law enforcement and how you progressed up towards chief?
Sure. So, just like I said earlier, I started off as a patrol officer. After I worked that for a period of time, then I start working a specialized unit. And that specialized unit was like street crimes, because then I went to learn how the narcotics worked back in the 80s. From there, I went to community policing because I wanted to do what I saw when I was growing up. And community policing is just being involved with the community. It's no longer, you're still taking people to jail, but now you're talking to the people. And you're not just going from call to call to call because the average patrol officer, he or she sits in their car, they wait for the next call, and they go to that call. They solve that problem. They go back and they sit in their car and they write a report and they wait for the next call. The community policing officer gets a chance to get out and meet people in the community. Like I said earlier, the average officer only meets 1 to 2% of the people in their
Mhm.
city because those are the only people that are calling 911. As a community police officer, I could meet, or I did get to meet 90% of the population because I'm
Mhm.
interacting with them every day.
Right.
So after I did that for a while, community policing, then I said, hey, I want to become a sergeant. So then I start studying for the sergeant exam, and that's cramming a lot. And they give us a year out because you got to learn, you got to really know the law, and you got to really know the policy and procedure. So test for that. First time I didn't do so great because I thought I knew it. I didn't have to study. So then I realized the next time I took the test, I would have to study. So second time around, I passed the test. At that time, I only had, because I was back in the 80s, only had an AA degree. And I was told if I wanted to move up, I had to go back and get my bachelor's degree. So then I worked as a road sergeant in charge of community policing because, again, that's where I wanted to be because I want to be with the community. Worked that for a while, and then I said I want to be promoted to a sergeant. And then the chief at the time says, okay, you want to be a sergeant? I'm going to make you a detective, put you a detective in economics division, white collar crime, so you can go to school at night. Because really, white collar crime is a Monday through Friday, and
Right.
sometimes you get called out. But then I was able to, I would tell anyone, don't do that way. Get your degree first and then get involved in law enforcement. Because it's very hard trying to work full time and go to school full time.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
So got my degree, and then the first thing I did was pass the lieutenant's exam. And the chief remembered what I said about. I said I want to sit in this chair one day. I said, okay, now I'm going to go back to patrol. I'm going to be a lieutenant in charge of patrol division. And he said, nope, you're not going there. You're going to go to budgeting. And I said, budgeting, and budgeting is really support services. So you're going to learn how to buy equipment. You're going to buy toilet paper. You're the supply person. You're going to learn
Mhm.
how that works. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years, and then after that, I got promoted to captain. Then I was in charge of division. Really, that's what helped me because I understood how the money worked. I understood about writing papers to go to city council for their approval. So I was able to manage that. So after I was captain for a period of time, then they sent me off to several management schools. One was a senior management school that was in Boston. And that's where they sent, if you really want to become a chief, then they're either going to send you to senior management school or they're going to send you to the FBI management school. And that lasts for about, one lasts for 3 weeks and then one lasts for 4 months. And you're away from home. And then in the state of Florida, they also have where that's like 6 months where you go to Tallahassee or down to Miami and you have instructors and they work with you and they send you back home to write papers. You write back in school and they send you back. You have all these papers due because, again, they're getting you prepared to write for send papers in, not send papers, but to write agenda items for city council, to write ordinance violations, whatever is needed to do, you got to be prepared for that.
Mhm.
So once I got all that down, and then I took my first police chief job, was in Somerville, Massachusetts. I worked there for 3 years. It was an eye opener because I was born and
Mm.
raised in Florida, but I learned a lot there because then now you have to learn about the unions, union contracts.
Right.
Um, the police department is very different than any other city department because usually we're talking earlier about unions. The police department is the only department that has all the unions. You have the police union, you have civilian union, you have white collar workers, blue collar workers. So because everybody works in the police department, both sworn and non-sworn.
Mhm.
So I worked there for 3 years. Then I was asked to come back to my original agency. I worked there for 4 years. And then I was asked to come here to St. Petersburg, and I've been here for 10 years. So remember I told you that average lifespan is
Was
5 years?
Yep. 4 to
I've been
5.
very fortunate. I'm coming up
Yeah.
on 17 years.
Wow.
Man,
That's awesome.
that's cool.
So you mentioned sworn versus non-sworn officers. Can you kind of describe what you mean when you say that?
Sure, and thank you for that. So sworn officers are the men and women that go to the police academy and they learn about law and they get sworn in to uh, make arrests. So they have the right to make an arrest. The non-sworn are really the backbone of the police department. So the non-sworn people, and I always say the heartbeat, it starts off in the communication center. Those are the people that are answering the 911 call. So they're the ones that are taking it out, taking all the information in, and giving it to the officers to where he or she knows where to go. The second most important division is the record division. They're the ones that take out a police report, make sure they're filed right correctly, and then when people come in and ask for police report, they can give them to them. And also they prepare those reports for when officers get ready to go to court. Then you have the property and evidence section where, again, sworn people take care of all the evidence that I bring in. They make sure that it doesn't violate the chain of custody, that once it's secure, it stays in a secure place. The other non-sworn positions are accounting, because someone's got to make sure we get paid and someone's got to make sure everything is paid for. And then my other division is I have lawyers assigned to me. So the lawyers that make sure we do everything correctly. So that's why I say sometimes police work is a corporation. It's everything that's in there.
Right. Yeah. So, in talking about your kind of trajectory, you mentioned your commitment to community oriented policing. And so that leads us to kind of dissecting and talking about policing strategies and styles. And community oriented policing is one of those, along with problem oriented policing and intelligence led policing. And just talking a lot from the other officers that have been involved in the podcast, it's very clear that you are committed to community oriented policing. So, can you kind of explain a little bit further what your take on community oriented policing is, and what it looks like for officers?
Sure. So everybody gets stuck on that theory of community oriented policing and they forget the key word, community. What community am I assigned to? Here in St. Petersburg, we have 3 different districts. Within those districts, we have over 150 odd neighborhoods. So that means you got to understand what neighborhood you're working in, because every neighborhood is policed a different way. You only can police the people the way people want to be policed. Uh, if you were to take one area would say, my biggest crime problem is people walking around with their dogs not on a leash, and we want you to come out there and enforce that. Bring out the SWAT team, whatever you want. That's their problem, and that's what you have to deal with. And in some areas, they're worried about they're being shot or someone being robbed. So it's a difference. So community policing is, first of all, understanding the community and what does the community need, and how you're going to enforce the laws within that community.
Mm. That's a really, really unique perspective. And I think that it answers a lot of questions for me, because generally, when we talk about community oriented policing, we're talking about the collective. We're talking about this larger idea and concept of community. And we tend to group everybody that is in a particular, city or whatever as part of this community. But from your perspective, community operates on a much more micro level, where we have a lot of different pockets of this idea of community. And for you, it's kind of rooted in neighborhood organization. And I also think that the other unique view or kind of stance that you have with regard to community oriented policing is that it should resemble or be organized in a way that you are meeting people where they are. And I think that that's really unique to the way that St. Pete does community oriented policing, that sets itself apart from other agencies that claim to do community oriented policing. And I think that it also highlights the difficulties that the general public have with kind of accepting and understanding what community oriented policing is because they often see examples of community oriented policing from a collective lens rather than the things that you're doing. I know that you have the Park Walk Talk, and that is very similar to earlier days of the way that officers interacted with individuals. They got to know each other, they knew who they were, and they were able to respond to them. And so I think that it's really important that we understand that nationally, community-oriented policing is viewed as this collective approach, right? But locally, the way that St. Pete is doing community-oriented policing is an individualized approach. And I think that that's what makes it so successful here, in my experience, my thoughts on what I've gathered from talking with you and the officers.
And I think it can work anyway. Just don't, and you said it great. what we do in St. Pete may not work in Tampa. What they do in Tampa may not work in Miami or Chicago, New York, or whatever. And I always say everybody just gets confused on that because there is a state statute. Everybody knows what a robbery is. Everybody knows, you can name all those things. But then when you look at it, you ask the question about local. Then we have local ordinance. But in some communities, they do things very differently. So some communities, the three of us, if we're from a certain community, when we get off from work, we may want to sit out on the side of the street and have a beer. And that's okay. That community accepts that. So as a community policing officer, the longer as they're not breaking the crime in their community,
Yeah.
let it go.
Yeah.
Now in certain communities, okay, that's not going to be tolerated. I'm going to come there and say, hey, you need to get out of the side of the street and you can't do that. If the community is accepting of it, then we should have to find a way to work with the community. Now, we're not going to say, hey, you're not going to rob someone, but if those men, women decide, hey, that's what I want to do, I want to play my music just a little bit loud because that's what we do, that's fine. But when you disturb someone else, then it's time for me to say, okay, you got to go turn that music down.
Right. So you're allowing communities to exist in the way that they've kind of constructed and designed their culture, and that's kind of what makes it unique. And like you said, it's not necessarily something that would work in those same ways in other areas because they have to adapt and adjust to fit them. And I think that that really speaks to what community-oriented policing is at its root, at its heart. It wasn't meant to be conceptualized as there is a one approach for all, but rather that these are individualized approaches. Can you talk a little bit about so there's other approaches to or strategies to policing. There is problem-oriented policing and there's intelligence-led policing. And often I think that individuals want to create a black and white system, an either or, where you either do community-oriented policing or you do problem-oriented policing or you engage in intelligence-led policing. From an agency standpoint, and law enforcement view, what are your ideas and thoughts about how you utilize these different strategies?
So they're all combined together. They're all intertwined together because they're the same thing. But again, go back to what does the community want? We're good at coming. We law enforcement. We're going to come into your community and tell you what we need to do. You want to get rid of drugs. You want to get rid of this. This is what you need to do. Reverse it. What do you want me to do? How do you want me to remove that bad element out of your community? So that's the first thing about problem-oriented policing. How are you going to solve the problem? Not how you're going to come in with a solution. How are you going to solve the problem with the people in there? Because they want the same thing you want. They don't want people out in front of their house selling drugs. They don't want all the things that you're trying to remove. They don't want that. So listen to them and figure out how they want to do it. Intelligent-led policing is you're gathering intelligence from them because they're telling you what the problem, how it's working, and then that's how you can move your people into that area. A lot of people say, well, hot spots, how do I create a hot spot? Well, I can tell anybody I can make a hot spot anywhere in the city. And they'll say, like, what do you mean by that? If I want to show a traffic problem, all I have to do is put 10 officers on one street corner and I write tickets all day long. And guess what it's going to show on data? That's a hot spot, but because I wrote tickets there all day.
I think you bring up a really amazing point because a lot of times the public doesn't understand the ways that we patrol and police and how it shapes crime data. A lot of times they want to identify certain communities as having a crime problem, right? But there are other factors that go into that. And I think that your point about, you can make it this or that, but it's really about like responding to the needs of the community. What do they want you to focus on and what do they want you to pay attention to? And I also think that you're spot on when you talk about the intertwinement of community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing, and intelligence-led policing, that it really takes a joint effort of all of these strategies to work towards combating and handling and managing the behaviors that we identify as problematic in our communities. I also want to talk a little bit about proactive versus reactive policing and hear what you have to say about the ways in which St. Pete views their kind of mission with regards to whether it should be proactive or reactive or a combination of the both.
So It's going to be a combination of both, but what we really should be doing is proactive. I can tell you, no matter where I am, when crime's going to happen. Uh, and we say spring and fall, and people say, why spring and fall? I can tell you burgers are going to go up, whether it's in Tampa, whether it's in St. Pete, throughout the United States. Why is burgers going to go up during spring? Because the weather's nice. We're going to leave our doors and our windows open, so we're not securing our home. In the fall, the same thing. During summer, Florida summer, and Florida winter, we lock our house because we got the heat going on, we got the AC, so we're securing our home. So we can look at that. So problem-oriented policing, proactive policing is getting out in front because we know when things are going to happen and getting out of our cars and meeting with the people in the community so we can tell them how to react. Reactive policing is that's going to happen. That is, it's going to be, there was a shooting here, so we need to put more officers there. There's a shooting over there, we need to put more officers over there. There is a crime spree of people breaking into cars, so we have to react to that data. And that data is people calling in on crime. Not that we're creating the data, but we're getting the data from the people. Because like I said, if I put officers in a certain area, then I can control that data because I'm creating that data.
Right.
Whereas when people are calling in, then they're giving me, I call it true data. If I say there's a drug hotspot, if I put all my officers in that area and all we do is make drug arrests that day, then again, when I look on a map, if I'm not careful, I'm going to say that's a drug hotspot. But I have to go back and the cause of it. Did I cause that hotspot or did the citizen cause that hotspot? And if I caused that hotspot, then that's not a true hotspot.
Right. Yeah. And I think that you make a very good point with the combination of proactive and reactive policing. There is an element that, we can influence and respond to things before they occur. But there is a large amount of things that we can't necessarily predict and prevent that we do have to respond to. And so when we're talking about proactive policing, we're talking about what can law enforcement do to help bring awareness to citizens to reduce their likelihood of being victimized or, targeted. And there are, campaigns like, make sure you lock your car when you go into the mall. They have the signs everywhere, or make sure you secure your house or whatever it may be. Those are ways of proactive policing. The reactive are when you respond to calls for service, right? So you get a call that's initiated by a citizen and you respond to that. And then you utilize the mechanisms that you have to do so. So the last point I want us to focus on is the kind of individual collective approach that law enforcement employ with regard to mindset, whether it be warrior or a guardian mindset. I know that with the militarization of police, a lot of individuals have kind of said law enforcement have adopted more of like a warrior mindset, right? Where they're going in to kind of fight some war that's going on or whatever it may be, and they need to go in and protect and fix. Whereas the guardian is they're seen more as protectors, and they're going to make sure that they are ensuring that individuals are safe and feel supported. What are your thoughts about the warrior versus guardian mindset? Is this something that even law enforcement really pay attention to or think about or even work towards or adopt one or the other?
We do, and it's hard, and a lot of it has to do with media, television, because a lot of things we see through the media or we see through in television. We see that, what we think a police officer is, and then some people that come in law enforcement, that's what I want to see. They see the officers kicking in doors and they
Right.
see all these pursuits and all the things that warrior mindset.
Right.
Well, you may only get that once a week
Right.
or 10 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And and again, you said we're talking about the mindset. You got to teach the officers before they become warriors, they got to become guardians. And the way I explain that to them is I go back and say, think about a castle. If you got a castle, you got to know who's in that castle. You got to know the people that are inside that castle. When that castle is being attacked, that's when you become a warrior. But if you don't know who's in there, how can you guard someone that you don't know? Because they can slip in, and when that gate closes, they can still be inside that castle when it's being
Mhm.
attacked. You got to know who's in there. So if you want to guard and protect someone, who am I guarding? Who am I protecting?
Right. I think I think that's interesting that you balanced those, because a lot of the times in classes we have that conversation about, do you want a warrior or do you want a guardian, right? Who do you want showing up to your house, right? And there's always a back and forth with students, because some students are like, well, if I'm in need, I want a warrior. I want somebody that's coming in and is ready to take them down. And then you've got other groups of students that are saying, well, no, I would rather have a guardian, right? Or think about victims, right? And I think that you make a really, really good point that there has to be a balance of both of those things going on, but they have to be able to read the room, so to speak, right? To
Mhm.
understand who they're dealing with, what they're dealing with, and why they're dealing with it, and then what response is actually warranted. And so I think that it kind of helps put those pieces together. And you also brought up another good point about the influence of media on not just the way the public views law enforcement, but the way that the law enforcement view themselves, right? And I think that I definitely see a lot of students that come in and they want to be this, media perception of what law enforcement is, kicking in the doors and getting the bad guys. But at the end of the day, it really takes a lot of work in really being very, very good at communicating and meeting individuals and members of the community kind of where they are, right?
And you're absolutely correct in the way you were saying. Like I said, I would tell officers, listen to that call when it comes out, because I'm glad your student said that. So when you're going to that call, you're going to that call, according to what type of that call, you're maybe going to that call as a guardian, because you may just be going, the suspect is left, so the victim is there. So you're going there as a guardian, or
Mhm.
the suspect is still on scene, and maybe I do have to kick in that door. So they have to have that mindset of, what am I responding to first? Is it
Right.
a priority
Mhm.
call? Someone's breaking into someone's home? Then yeah, you want me coming there, lights and sirens and kicking in the door,
Right.
or I'm having a problem with my child, or uh, my child's been sexually assaulted. So when I walk in that house, I'm not a warrior. I'm a guardian, because I want to get as
Right.
much information as I can. Then I'm going to become a warrior when I want to try to find that person that caused harm.
Right.
So they have to listen to that radio and have to understand, where am I going, and what am I trying to handle once I get there.
That takes a lot of
Absolutely.
balance and a lot of self-discipline. Uh, wow.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's really important that we recognize that to be officers, to be these individuals that respond to some of the worst things, there has to be a balance between warrior and guardian, and they have to be able to assess that in real time and know what's the appropriate response.
And it's going to take time. I'm not going to
Mhm.
sit here and tell you, when I first got on the job, I wanted to be that warrior. I would be listening and waiting for that call.
Right. Yeah.
And then sometimes the guardian goes, I don't want to do that.
Mhm.
But that was really what I was supposed to do. So I
Mhm.
could be a warrior.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
I
thank
guess.
y'all for coming out and talking. This is The Beat. This is the podcast where we talk about building equity, accountability, and trust with law enforcement. Thank you.